In this video, we're going to put together various components of expenditure on GDP and come up with the aggregate preferred expenditure and then use it to determine equilibrium level of income in the short run in a situation where prices are sticky in the sense that they continue their trend and they're not affected much by what's happening to the GDP. For now, we're going to keep that assumption and later on come back and see how prices respond to the trends in GDP. Here's putting all those components together. D is aggregate preferred expenditure. It consists of preferred consumption, which we showed as a function of disposable income, C of Y minus T, also a function of real investment, which in turn is a function of real interest rate. And the real interest rate, remember, is nominal interest rate minus expected inflation. I highlight these variables because I want to look at how they impact total expenditure and eventually how they determine GDP. Government expenditure is given, and net exports is a function of real exchange rate, EP over P star, our income domestically, and foreign income, Y star. The key variables that I'm interested in to determine at this stage are income and interest rate. Remember, in the previous course on macroeconomic variables and markets, we showed that interest rate is determined by income. Income drives the decision of how much to hold money, and that affects the interest rate in the money market. We're now going to introduce another relationship between these two variables and see how interest rate affects income, and later on put the two together to figure out how both income and interest rate are determined jointly. The expression for D that I have, either the more extensive one at the top or the more simplified one that focuses on real income and interest rate, has a lot of other variables in it, but they're implicit. For example, wealth is part of consumption. We know that. I didn't highlight it to reduce the number of symbols here. Later on, we're going to be looking at all these factors one by one and introducing them and highlight them as needed. So let's put real income on the horizontal axis and D, the aggregate preferred expenditure, on vertical axis. And let's map D versus real income. We should get a curve, or actually the way I've drawn it is a line. We should get a line like this. As income grows, total aggregate expenditure in the economy should grow. Let's see where does this growth comes from. The main component that drives aggregate expenditure up is consumption. As our income goes up, we consume more, which is this first component here, and that drives total expenditure up. You might say that as income grows, our net export should go down, so it should have a counterbalancing effect on total expenditure. That's true, but the net effect is normally positive because as we spend more, only part of it falls on imports. A lot of it falls on domestic goods and services, and as a result, the total of C plus NX should go up as our income goes up. We've seen that in the previous video that real income does not have much of an impact on investment. At least current income doesn't have much of an impact, although expected future growth might have, which that would be implicit in this part of the aggregate expenditure. But as far as D is concerned and its relationship with real income, there should not be much of an impact of current income on investment. And as far as government expenditure is concerned, we assumed it's fixed for now. Later on, we're going to come back and see how any changes in government expenditure and its response to income might affect the outcome here. Let me highlight a couple of facts. The curve just very much looks like the consumption function. Given income, it tells us how much total aggregate expenditure we have in the economy. And it's flatter than the 45-degree line. the reason it's flatter is that consumption is flatter. And remember that net exports go down as income goes up. So D curve is even flatter than the C curve. So now that we've learned what the D curve is all about, let's see how various variables might be affecting it. For example, let's focus on a decline in interest rates. Suppose that somehow the Fed has lowered the interest rate. Let's see what happens to the aggregate preferred expenditure. Let's say our income is initially at Y0, price level is given, and all other variables are given, except that exchange rate might be responding to interest rate based on interest parity condition that we've seen in the previous course. So at income level Y0, if interest rate goes down, investors would like to invest more. So they spend more, and that becomes additional expenditure on goods and services in our economy. So aggregate preferred expenditure goes up at that income level Y0. But this is true at any level of income. At a higher level of income over here also, you're going to see an increase in aggregate expenditure if interest rates go down. Given this, this whole curve should be moving up. Notice also that when interest rates go down, the exchange rate also depreciates, and that will also increase net exports. So that will be an additional factor that shifts the D curve upward. Now that we've learned what aggregate preferred expenditure is, we've seen what the D curve is and how it shifts with various variables, and you can look at the impact of other variables on the D curve as an exercise. We're going to use it to determine GDP in the short run. To do that, remember that at any moment in the economy, as we've seen in the previous course, aggregate income and aggregate expenditure have to be exactly equal to each other. The 45-degree line, or the green line here, represents where the economy has to be. The blue line, or the aggregate preferred expenditure curve, tells us where people would like to be given their level of income. The equilibrium of the economy comes about when where people would like to be is exactly where they have to be. And that happens only at the crossing point of the two curves, at Y0 and D0. At Y0, people earning real income Y0, and they're spending on goods and services produced domestically exactly equal to D0. And that D0 is exactly the income people earn. So the income that people earn is consistent with their expenditure. There's no motive to change. There's no force to change the outcome. That's why we call it equilibrium. Let's see what happens if this is not the case. For example, let's suppose that income is at Y0 and we want to know what forces are going to be changing the economy. What forces are going to be changing the level of income or aggregate expenditure? Why we can't be at equilibrium at Y0. At D0, the total expenditure on the economy is more than the income generated. What does this mean? It means that businesses are going to see demand coming to their doors. More goods are sold, more services are sold than they've produced, so they can use their inventories to sell more, or they have to hire more workers, or to have to expand production immediately to meet the demand. As a result, there's going to be a pressure on output to increase. Specifically, any good that is inventoried is going to see the inventory decline, and businesses start hiring more workers, producing more in order to replenish their inventories. Exactly the excess demand created in the economy is equal to this size of this arrow, the difference between D0 and Y0, and that drives up income. In fact, the difference between D0 and Y0 immediately becomes income, and that means that income of the economy is no longer going to be at Y0, it's going to be at Y1, which equals D0. But at Y1, people are going to have more income, and therefore they're going to be spending more. That additional expenditure is going to show up as a higher aggregate preferred expenditure, that itself generates more demand for goods and services, which becomes income, and that additional income then generates its own demand, and this continues until the economy reaches the crossing point. So the economy can't be in equilibrium at any point to the left of the crossing point between the two curves. Now let's look at the other side. Suppose income is already at y0 and expenditure is at d0, and the crossing point is to the left of y0. What happens here is that people are earning y0, but they're not spending enough. As a result, there's some excess inventories that are going to be piling up, the difference between y0 and d0. Or goods and services are being produced, but there's not enough demand, so businesses have to cut back on production. Cutting back on production means employing less workers, making less profit, paying less rent. Income shrinks to y1. And at y1, again, income is bigger than the aggregate preferred expenditure, although there's less income and people cut back on their expenditure, but still there's a gap between expenditure and income, and as a result, there's going to be excess production that needs to be cut. Once that's cut, income drops, expenditure drops, income drops, and that drives the economy towards the crossing point. Once the economy reaches the crossing point, then there's no further force to move the economy within equilibrium unless some parameter changes. Let's use this framework to figure out what happens when government expenditure changes. Let's say government expenditure declines. So here's the D expression, the aggregate preferred expenditure expression, and here's the curve. So we're in equilibrium at y0, d0, and let's say government expenditure declines. At whatever level of income we are, aggregate expenditure declines. So this causes the whole D curve to shift down. And finally, so the crossing point of the aggregate expenditure curve and the 45-degree line moves down from y0, d0 to y1, d1. The equilibrium, we say, moves from d0, y0 to d1, y1. Reduction in government expenditure reduces the level of income. And this happens with a multiplier. Notice that the reduction in income, this much, is bigger than the reduction in government expenditure. The reason is that as government expenditure goes down, income declines, and people who used to receive that money now spend less, and their expenditure decline reduces income of others. And that multiplies until the economy comes to the new equilibrium. The multiplier could be large, could be small. We're going to examine the empirical results concerning the multiplier effect later on. Another variable that affects the equilibrium level of income is tax, the amount of taxes. Remember that we're taking taxes as exogenous right now, but even if you're just referring to a fixed tax rate, we're going to get a very similar result. So let's say taxes go down. If taxes go down, that leads to an increase in disposable income, and therefore households can spend more, and that will increase the aggregate expenditure in the economy. One can also do this graphically. The whole D curve shifts up, and the crossing point of the D curve and the 45-degree line should move up, raising the level of income. This technique is often used to stimulate the economy during recessions. When consumers are not spending enough, sometimes governments spend more, and sometimes combine it with tax cuts in order to stimulate expenditure. Of course, some economists argue that it's a good idea to shop anyway. In fact, some psychologists have argued that it's good for your health to go shopping, especially if you're depressed. That could be very helpful. It could cost you less than a therapist, and it also brings you goodies that you may enjoy and use later on. Okay, so now let's do one more exercise with this model. We've developed a model of equilibrium level of the economy in the short run, given prices, given foreign income, given interest rate, given taxes, etc. And what we want to know in this example is what happens if expected inflation goes up. So here's my question. Do you expect the D curve to shift up, shift down, not shift, or may shift up, shift down, depending on other parameters? Well, if you focus on what happens as a result of the increase in expected inflation and trace the effect, you should be answering A. Why does the D curve shift up as a result of an increase in expected inflation? If interest rate is given, an increase in expected inflation means that you're going to get rewarded better in the future financially if you invest. So investment should go up. So once investment goes up, because real interest rate is going down, that means that total expenditure on the economy goes up, and therefore D should go up for every level of income, or the whole D curve should shift up.